今天的这期节目非常的特别，这个是我担任主持人的第一场全英文访谈。那我邀请来的是加拿大的作家 Scott Young， 他被媒体称为是学习之神，因为他在学习呢，透过1年之内他在麻省理工学院的4年课程他就把它完成了，而且他还学了好多种不同的语言。那我今天呢会聊聊他的2本畅销书《超速学习》还有《超速进步》。那《超速进步》是他的最新一本书。那今天这期节目的访谈会是全英文进行的。OK， 那我们就全英文的访谈开始来进行咯。Okay, hi Scott. I just introduced the audience about this is our first time full English interview. So I'm really excited and happy to have you here. So I know I can speak Chinese. Could you please speak Chinese to our audience a little bit?
对，当然，我会说一点普通话。你可以说国语，因为我们是在台湾。但是我没有那么专业的词汇，所以如果我要说关于我的本书，我的这些题目，我觉得英文是比较标准，所以我要道歉，大家需要听我的英文，但是谢谢你，我觉得可能是一个非常有意思的对话。
Yeah. Yeah, of course. Thank you, Scott. I love both of your books so much.
Thank you.
The first one and this one. So I really admire your insight on learning. So I think you are someone who has turned the learning into an art. So
high praise. Yeah. Thank you.
It's true. So now I have so many questions for you. And the first one, I have a question for you is that before you started those public learning experiments, such as the MIT Challenge and the language learning project, what is the biggest trigger or the motivation that led you to take on the learning challenge?
Yeah, so I think I could answer that in 2 ways. So one way would be that I feel like I've always been really driven by learning. And so I think, even when I reflect on when I would be in high school and beyond, I was very interested in learning new skills and teaching myself things. But it just so happened that when I was sort of going into university, I kind of came of age during the blogging era, which now is like 2 decades in the past. So I'm now dating something that happened a while ago. But during that time period, there were a lot of people who were doing these kind of public projects, some of them involving learning that really directly inspired me, directly influenced me. So some examples of that would be Steve Pavlina was one of my early inspirations of blogging. He was a personal development blogger, and he wrote an essay about how he did a double major in computer science and mathematics in 3 semesters. So that's like about a year and a half. So that was one of my this might be possible. If you were a clever student, you were like really, really good at with your time and managing your time and doing this kind of thing, it might be possible. Another example was Benny Lewis, very direct inspiration from my language learning projects. He was, even before I did the MIT Challenge project, he was doing these Fluent in 3-month projects where he would go to a new country and just try to learn as much as possible, often getting to a pretty decent level in, Polish or Thai or some other language in 3 months, which seemed absurd to me at the time. But, really studying his method was a big inspiration for my own project. And other people like Josh Kaufman, he had what called the personal MBA, which was trying to self-study an MBA. So these were all kind of in the air, I guess you could say, when I was doing this. So even though, I think if you ignore that background and just sort of see me as a singular example, it really makes me stand out. But I feel like, I was someone who was writing, I was blogging in that time period. So I think just this idea of doing interesting projects, trying to document them publicly, trying to picking things that were in some cases maybe a little bit arrogant, a little bit a little bit audacious. That was sort of in the air at that time period. And so that was the more direct inspiration, but certainly learning and studying. I mean, I don't know. I just keep coming back to these topics because I feel they're so central to, life or experience of meaning. We can get into that as well, but I feel like that's sort of inherent in my personality as well.
So it sounds like there's a sweet spot, it's doable, but it's still challenge. Do you struggle during this period?
Yeah, I mean, I think if I can kind of like break down some of the secret sauce as well, I think sometimes the MIT challenge project that I did, which you sort of mentioned briefly in the introduction, just to like reiterate what it was, MIT posts a lot of their materials online for free. So if you go to ocw.mit.edu, you can find partial or complete materials for many MIT classes. So they just put this online. And it was, again, talking about these examples, it was sort of piecing together, okay, could I get enough final exams that broadly matches what the MIT curriculum is? And because you have the exam, you have the solutions, you would need to go to MIT. You could just like self-study and do this. So that was the idea behind the challenge, was to do these final exams and to do the programming projects. And that project was, I would say, different from how I actually have mostly done projects, in that I decided I was going to try to do it in 1 year before I started it, which I think is always a risky move. It turned out in my favor, but it's always a risky move because with learning, it's very difficult to estimate how long it will take you to necessarily reach certain levels of proficiency. It's the prediction process is hard. And so with this one here, I did do a lot of planning, and I did like do some mock classes and like, okay, this is like how long it's taking to do the class. And, can I actually fit this in the time frame? But even then, I think I got a good dose of luck. Like, it just turned out that some of the earlier classes were actually harder than some of the later classes. And so I benefited from, like, if it had gone the other direction and they had just gotten steadily harder as they went on, maybe it would have taken me more than 12 months. So there was a little bit of a gamble there. But I would say that for most of my projects, to go to your question about this sweet spot of difficulty, most of my projects, often what I've been like fixing is the kind of like time investment or the method. And then there's a lot more flexibility to adjust it. So the language learning one, for instance, I wasn't nearly as confident as Benny Lewis. Like, I didn't say, okay, fluent in 4 languages in 1 year. Like, I wasn't making that call before we did it. Instead, it was going to be, okay, well, we're going to kind of take this somewhat intense method, we're not going to speak English when we go to these different countries. We're going to, when we're in Spain, we're just going to speak Spanish. Now, we had no idea how good we would get after 3 months. Like, maybe we wouldn't be able to speak it at all. Like, maybe it would just be a total disaster. But we set up this kind of constraint so that, like, well, we knew that we would probably do as well as we could do under that 3-month time frame. And so that tends to be how I like to pick these projects and suggest these challenges to people, is the more that you can kind of like set yourself up so that you're maximally motivated, maximally putting in your time, you're using an effective method, then, you really don't know how far you can go. Sometimes you'll go really far. Sometimes things will be unexpectedly challenging. Sometimes things will be easier than you were expected. So, I mean, that's part of the joy of doing these kinds of projects.
Yeah, so you control what you can control. And you don't expect the time frame, but you still know what effort you put into, and you will get the result, no matter how sooner or not.
Yeah, I mean, I think, like, to use the language learning example, and like, how good could you get at a language if you made it really like this sort of obsessive priority for a period of time? And I think just the fact is, most people don't go that far, like they're not going that extreme, so you don't know, right? So I think that's one of the kind of ideas behind these projects.
Wow. And back then, and I want to compare to now. So how does your learning motivation compare to now? Because before you are so motivated in learning. And what about now?
Yeah. I think the main way I've changed is that I'm older. I have kids and like a business and stuff. So I don't have the ability to like, I'm just going to spend 70 hours a week doing this project. But I think the ethos of these projects still really informs my life. Like, I very recently finished a project, very different in like style, but it was a project where I took a year and I split it up into 12 months, and each month was dedicated to some area of life that is particularly important for your well-being and success. So I was calling them foundations. So like 1 month was about fitness, 1 month was about personal finance, 1 month was about relationships. Like, we had different months of this. And so basically each month was a combination of me reading a ton of books and sort of reporting on what I learned, and then also changing habits and stuff. So as a project, it looked very different from the previous ones, but I think it was also a little bit more reflective of where my life was right now. Like, with 2 small kids, I was going to like jet off to some foreign country and stop speaking my mother tongue. But I think these projects that I've done and some of the things I've tried to document, I hope people abstract away some of the specifics and just sort of take maybe some of the broader ethos, because I think that's what I hope people will tailor to their individual situation. Because, if you are 22 and you have like a gap year after university, you're in a very different position than someone who's like 45 and you have a demanding job and you're also you have kids at home and things like that. Like those are different situations, right?
Yeah, so I think the sooner we learn how to learn, the better that like we compound our life with that. Yeah, and another question for you is that during the experiment of your MIT challenge and the language learning projects, do you ever doubt about your methods, or do you encounter any setbacks, and how do you overcome them?
Yeah, I mean, I think for those projects in particular, one of the things that I had going for me was that because they were big public projects, I did actually test things out before I did them. So it wasn't like I went in completely blind. So for the MIT challenge, for instance, I'd already kind of self-studied a couple of the classes, and I did even one class of the 33 that I was doing. I did one class under the like same time constraints. So I could really get a feel for like, okay, how would this actually work? And that doesn't mean that you're necessarily going to get it all right. And you do encounter difficulties. Like I definitely found, like for the MIT challenge ones, I actually found a lot of the computer science stuff was not too bad, but I found that the more physics, calculus-based classes harder because they often required you to like, to get really good at doing those kinds of equations and problem solving required a lot of practice, which was harder to get enough time for. So I could like often understand conceptually, but then like, remembering the trig identities and stuff like this, that was more of a challenge than that. So you do encounter these little obstacles and you try to work around them. And like the language learning project prior to doing that one, so before I did this language learning project, I kind of had some experiences learning French. I did an exchange in France.
Okay.
And I had kind of like experienced doing it badly. And then I also had experience doing it better. So I did a year in France, and then I did another month where I tried out this kind of like only speaking in French method. And so that kind of gave me confidence that this was sort of the right approach. Now, I didn't know how well it would work. And if I reflect upon it, I would say that the no English rule, that approach worked extremely well in like Spain and Portugal. And I would say it worked somewhat well we were in mainland China and South Korea when we were doing the 3 months, although we did spend a little bit of time in Taiwan. But they worked as well. But I would say that like probably to like, fully benefit from it, 3 months was a little short for Asia, but that's one of those things that you don't know in advance, right? Yeah. I think I underestimated how much harder Chinese and Korean would be compared to Spanish going in. I thought like, it'd be a little bit harder, but I think actually if you look at one of my favorite sources of this is the CIA in the United States. So the Central Intelligence Agency, it's a government agency that trains, diplomats and spies and things like that. Yeah, and they have a foreign service institute where they kind of like training people who are going to go live in these other countries. And they have sort of benchmarks for like how much formal studying time is required for someone to be like operative in that country, to like be fully proficient so that they can do their job in that other country. And so I found it very interesting because they have kind of like more rigorous benchmarks on the difficulty of different languages. And so in their classification, and this is also to keep in mind, this is using English as the base language. That's really important because what your base is determines what's easy and what's not. Like if you speak Mandarin, learning Cantonese is fairly easy compared to learning French, right? Yeah. Yes. But if you're English, learning Cantonese is just as hard as learning Mandarin. They're both really hard, right? And so for this English background, I think the estimate was that you needed about, now I'm going to get the numbers wrong here, but I want to say it was about 500 hours of studying time for like languages like Spanish. And it was more like 2,000 hours for Mandarin Chinese. So it's more like, I was thinking it was like 1.5 times as difficult prior to going into it. And then when you're actually doing it, you're like, oh no, it's actually more like 4 times as difficult. So it would have been interesting going through that. But I mean, I still don't have any regrets about the project because after I spent that time, I was in Kunming. That was where we spent the bulk of the time. It was such a great experience that like when I came back here to Vancouver, I was able to practice a bit more and improve my reading and stuff. So I would still say I'm not perfect in Mandarin, as witnessed by the fact that we're doing this in English. But I think again the message that I try to convey to people is, trying these things out, seeing how far you can go. That there's a real value in that, even if you don't do it perfectly.
Wow, I get so much like inside stories from the first book. Because, I have to confess that I love your first book because it inspired me of learning. Actually, it is. So I've also shared a very long blog post and I draw a schematic about your first book, Ultra Learning.
Thank you.
I really like it very much. And I wanted to compare two of your books because in your first book, you focuses on like learning methods and the learning tools and some success stories. However, in your second book, like this one is the Chinese version, the Get Better at Anything. 超速进步. And you discuss more about like learning frameworks and the mental models. So I wanted to know what's the reason that led you to decide to explore this topic of learning in a different way?
So it's not easy to answer. I think that there's like a really complicated, long-winded, like how I exactly got into writing the second book we go into. But the short version of it is that basically after Ultra Learning had finished, like I began writing Ultra Learning from my personal vantage point. So it was my stories. Like I already mentioned some of the stories of people who inspired me. I found more people that were doing other projects that I hadn't heard of when I was doing my projects. And these were all like, I wanted to bring those together and kind of share this idea of ultra learning, which I kind of define as intensive self-directed learning. So, people are always like, what makes something an ultra learning project? It's just, I'm just defining it this way. So just to kind of compare it with, formal education or, dabbling or things that people do. So in that sense, a lot of people are doing ultra learning projects. It's not something unique to me. But when I started doing this, I started digging into a lot of the learning research. That was always something that had interested me, but it wasn't until I started writing Ultra Learning that I started kind of like cracking that nut, so to speak. And I think it's one of those things about curiosity and learning in general is that before you start learning about something, you don't have a lot of questions about it. But then as you learn more and more, it kind of becomes more exciting and interesting to you. So the sort of the irony is that I wrote the first book and the thing you'd logically conclude is that like, well, okay, I've said everything I want to say on this topic, let's move on to the next thing. But it was the opposite. It was like, there were so many questions that I felt like were unanswered and that I didn't understand. And so I spent a couple years doing a ton of research. And so the, I guess it's超速进步in Taiwanese edition, right? So Get Better at Anything in English. That one was much more about understanding the research. And for me, it was trying to be like, what are the mental models that you should apply to learning? Like, how should you think about how learning works and how it applies? And I found a lot of these ideas that are like quite deep in cognitive science, cognitive psychology, educational psychology. Like there were so many like threads that I wanted to tie together. And so in that one, I would say that in comparison to Ultra Learning, it's a little bit more general. It's a little bit more kind of at a higher level, like what is learning? How does it work? But I think they paired it together nicely because if Ultra Learning is kind of like a window into a very specific kind of subculture and success stories and people, then Get Better at Anything is kind of like, I think making sense of how it all fits together. And so I'm very proud of that book. I think that for a lot of people like you, I think that, a lot of people really like gravitate towards Ultra Learning because it has some of the more dramatic stories and it maybe has that. But I think if you are someone who really likes learning and you are interested in how it works, then I would recommend also reading Get Better at Anything because there's many ideas and concepts that, it just changed my whole paradigm for how I think about a lot of these things. And I've tried to explicate that in the book, like how I think about learning in that way.
Yeah, because I find a very interesting difference is that we say people are average learner because maybe many people are average learner, but some people are advanced learner or better learner. And what better learner do is they have mastery in some area. So your second book tells us about how to get mastery or how to get better at anything. Yeah. So what is your definition of average learner and maybe advanced learner?
That's challenging. That's challenging to say because why are some people better at learning certain subjects than others? And this, I think just to be quite bland about giving an answer, I would say that it's probably the case that it's a mixture of some amount of inherent talent, some amount of correct method, some amount of like motivation and interest and like diligence and work ethic. And I think depending on the situation, which one seems to be more important will vary, depending on whether we're looking at like Nobel Prize winning physicists or, students in a typical grade school or these kinds of things, these kinds of factors will matter. But I think it's at the level of like, how do people learn effectively? It's interesting seeing how all of these sorts of different, like you could call them psychological principles or mechanisms come into play. So like one of the big ones that I document in Get Better at Anything, it's one of those things that once it's stated, it sounds obvious, but it kind of was like a light bulb for me about like how important this is, but that basically so much of our learning is essentially imitative, not imitative in this sort of like really superficial sense, like we just, just copy what someone's doing without understanding it, but essentially someone else has solved the problem. They've not only maybe like in their hand movements and this kind of stuff solve the problem, like you just do this and press these exact buttons, but the mental models that they have, the way they think about the problem, this kind of thing, those are very hard won. It's very difficult to develop those. It's very difficult to invent a new idea, a new technique. But once someone has that idea, you can learn from that. You can extract that knowledge from them. And so your ability to learn from other people is, I would say, for most skills, probably the primary bottleneck. Now, it's certainly the case that, for some skills, especially ones that we teach in school widely, the communication of the skill is like mostly there. And so, you can look at differences in different students and say, well, it's more work ethic or more talent or more some other factor. But if we're thinking about like the progress of knowledge and problem solving in general, certainly this ability to learn from other people is primary. And so I think, this aspect of learning, like how do you sort of quickly assimilate what patterns other people have learned that have come before you is so important. So I devote the first third of the book to this principle I call C, which is just sort of how this determines not only your ability to learn, like your ability to kind of quickly acquire knowledge and skills, but also your motivation too. So this goes, I think, also ties into that other factor as well, that, why are some people so motivated to work hard and study and learn? Clearly that's important. And I think a big part of that is this concept known as self-efficacy, or this idea that like you are more motivated to learn things when you think it's both valuable and you're likely to succeed at it. And how do you develop this self-efficacy? It's largely, again, through observation of seeing other people like you succeed and also from experiencing yourself. And so there's just so much research on like how this particular aspect of learning can, if you get it right, it can go really smoothly and you can learn well. And if you get it wrong, even if you're really smart, even if you're really hardworking, progress can grind to a halt.
Wow. I get so much information from your conversation. There's something sparkles in my brain. Yeah. So let's dig more about your second book, the Get Better at Anything. I think you propose like 3 principles of mastery, like learning from others, like the role model, right? Learning from others, and learning from our own practice, and learning from our experience or others' experience. Yeah. So could you briefly explain what each of these approaches means?
Yeah, so I don't know how they translated it, but the 3 ideas in English were see, do, and feedback. And I really sort of recognize that all 3 of these factors are extremely important for how we learn. So C is this idea that I talked about earlier, that most learning is not trial and error, right? If we had to learn things by trial and error, we wouldn't learn very much.
Yes.
There's this great anthropologist and economist who teaches at Harvard called Joseph Heinrich. He wrote a book, the English title is called The Secret of Our Success. Great book. And in it, he talks about how basically people there's a long history of like what separates man from the other animals. And the idea being that, well, we are so much smarter. We have like raw cognitive capabilities that are much better than, let's say, chimpanzees or this kind of thing.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't doubt that that's true, but interestingly enough, there is a number of like papers and studies that show that actually if you deal with small children, so children who have not the benefit of culture, which is like our real asset, like they're actually not that much better at learning than, gorillas or crows or some of these sort of smarter birds and mammals. The thing that separates them is that they're extremely good at picking up a solution once someone else has found it. And that, it turns out, is actually rare in the animal kingdom. That like gorillas can learn by trial and error, not that much worse than a human being can. The thing they can't do is when someone else figures out how to do it, they can't immediately copy it. And that's the thing that we're extremely good at. And so this idea of C is just sort of based on like how much of our knowledge comes from other people, of learning from their examples. So you mentioned role models, but in some way that takes the idea too narrow. This is a much more broad principle that, you know, if you are learning something, being able to figure out how other people solved it, what are the steps they took, what are the mental models they applied, what are the concepts, like extracting that from other people, whether it's from books, from classes. I use the example in the book of people who are like extremely good at the video game Tetris, and how like, you know, since the emergence of things like live streaming, proficiency has gone way up because it's so much easier to learn, like, oh, this is what they're doing. Whereas before it was just kind of lore that like, oh, so-and-so got to level, you know, 31 and you'll be like, oh, I don't believe that, or this kind of thing. Whereas now you can like actually see which buttons they're pressing. And so this is such an important factor. The do factor is obviously, in order to get good at something, you need to practice it. And I think this was one of the things that also I found very interesting from the research, because I think there's a sort of a naive perception among a lot of people that just doing something over and over again is like the key to getting good at it. Like, you know, practice makes perfect. That's what we've been told, right? Yeah. And it certainly is important, but it's very important to know what it's doing. So the thing that you're doing when you practice something over and over again is you're making it more and more fluent. So you're making it easier and easier to do the same thing over and over again. And that's certainly important. Like if you're speaking another language, fluency is everything, right? Like if you have to spend, you know, a few minutes thinking about each word you want to say, you're not going to be able to have a conversation. But what it doesn't necessarily do is make you that much better. Now you can get a bit better just through practicing. You kind of learn from a little bit of trial and error. I don't want to say that you never improve just by doing something repeatedly, but it's pretty clear that for a lot of skills, just doing something over and over again actually plateaus. You don't actually get that much better. You kind of hit like this sort of stable point. And one of the ideas that good examples that really like struck in my mind from this is if you think about typing on a keyboard. Yeah. So when you type on a keyboard, chances are you do one of two methods. Now I don't know exactly how it works. It might be a little bit different. The Chinese characters and doing it with the Daiyin. I don't even know whether you do
so many
that
types.
Yeah, I don't know how you do it in Taiwan too, because you use the Bopao Mafo or whatever. Yeah. That one is a little bit different, right? And so, but in English at least, you know, we have a QWERTY keyboard and you type in the letters and it's fairly straightforward. And so most people, I would say either you learn it kind of on your own, and if you do so, you usually do something what we call hunting and pecking, where you kind of use one or two fingers, maybe a third finger comes in there, and you're just looking at the keyboard and you're typing. And I know a lot of people of my parents' generation and stuff, that's how they type, right? Because they never had any classes and they just learned to type that way. Or you do what we call touch typing, and where you kind of put all the fingers on what's called the home row and you move them in a particular pattern like this, and it's much more efficient. And the thing that I would say, like, again, just to like summarize this entire really broad principle of do and like why practice both matters and why it's limited, as you do both of these, you do the touch typing or the hunting and pecking, you get better at each of them. So as you practice it, you get to become a better touch typer, you become faster, you make fewer mistakes. Same thing with hunting and pecking. But if you started hunting and pecking, you very rarely, unless you actually consciously put in a lot of deliberate practice, you very rarely transition to touch typing. In other words, you can spend decades hunting and pecking, it never becomes touch typing, right? And it's because you're getting more and more fluent at what is essentially an inferior way of doing it. And so this became the basis of one of my, you know, intellectual heroes, Anders Ericsson, his idea of deliberate practice. And deliberate practice is this idea that you're trying to, in some ways, exert greater cognitive control, taking back this automaticity, making it less fluent, so you can force yourself to a better level of performance. And this is very hard to do, and I think a lot of people struggle with it, but I think it's an important factor to realize is that this practice is so important. It's essential for getting good at a lot of skills, but it's not a panacea. It's not something that just cures all of your learning problems. And the third part is feedback. And feedback, I think, is one of these ones that has, again, like this narrow interpretation where you're thinking about like a teacher or a coach telling you what you did wrong. But it also has this broader connotation of just sort of like anytime you get information from the world about your efforts. So, you know, if you try to write computer code and it doesn't compile, then you know you made a mistake, right? That's another kind of feedback. Or if you know, kick the soccer ball and it didn't go the way you wanted it to go, that's a kind of feedback. And so it's obvious that feedback plays an important role in learning. And I would argue as well that in areas where there isn't good feedback, or you have poor feedback or not well calibrated feedback, you can be in these kind of what are called wicked environments where essentially you don't get much better at a skill, even though you do it a lot. So you stay at a fairly low level of ability. And so, writing this book for me, again, the scope is almost too broad. It's like it covers too many things, but I was really trying to get at like, what are these sort of deep principles and how do they apply for, not just learning programming or learning languages, but how the mind works and how that plays into learning in general.
Yeah, so I wanted to talk more about some like abstract topic and some more application topic. Yeah, so for some abstract topic like highly theoretical fields like philosophy, sociology, or theoretical physics, and where there's no clear outcome or feedback, right? So how do you determine you've truly learned it?
Yeah.
Because some skills that are too broad or too abstract.
So there's kind of two answers to this question. And I think it's one of those ones where it's sort of obvious when you realize it, but again, it's sort of like I want to spell it out explicitly here. But what does it mean to be good at something like philosophy? Has kind of two senses. One sense is a kind of with reference to some kind of basic reality. So in this sense, being good at philosophy would be like having cogent arguments and being like correct about, principles of ethics or metaphysics or whatever philosophers are debating about. Or similarly with physics, being good at physics would be like having correct scientific intuition about the physical reality of the world, right?
Yeah.
And in that case, you're right. It's very difficult to get feedback. And so, like for physics, for instance, I mean, this is why we have science. This is why we have experiments, right? Because you have to often go to like extreme lengths to get any feedback at all about whether your theories are right. I highly recommend the book by Sabrine Hossenfelder. Oh, I'm forgetting the title, but it's basically about, her critique of the sort of trend in physics, particularly string theory over the last few decades to like, kind of go into these theoretical cul-de-sacs, which, there's no experiment that can prove it right or wrong. And people are just arguing which is more elegant. Does the nature have 11 dimensions or 15 or, is it on this 2-dimensional manifold or whatever? And so this is, an example where like that sense of being good at physics has maybe become decoupled because in order to discover new laws of physics, you need these incredibly huge particle accelerators that cost billions of dollars. And so, as an average graduate student, you're not going to get it, right? On the other hand, and this is where I'm talking about the second sense, on the other hand, when we talk about philosophy and physics, what does it mean to be good at them? Practically speaking, often what we're talking about is having esteem inside a community. So being seen as an expert. So that means publishing papers that other physicists think are good, or other philosophers think are good arguments, or, this is novel, this is good work. And in that sense, I think you do get a lot of feedback, right? So if you are writing papers and you're, working with graduate advisors, it doesn't mean that it's easy to become a philosopher or physicist. Certainly I'm not, cut out for it. But I think that in that sense, you are getting feedback about something a little different. You're not getting feedback about this, objectively, whether or not your theories are right or wrong, but kind of like, are you writing a good paper that other people who have expertise in your field think is convincing, think this is a good direction for the field, this kind of thing. And so I would say that, I have a chapter in the book about, I think it's called like experience doesn't guarantee expertise. I'm forgetting the exact maxim title in English. I should probably memorize them. But the basic idea was just about how experts of many stripes sort of fail in this second way. They fail in this comparing to objective reality when that is possible to do. So some of the examples include like psychologists doing parole assessments. So they're, looking at some criminal offender and then doing some sort of assessment of like, are they likely to be a repeat offender for some crime? And it turns out that they do worse than if you just sort of like tally the pros and cons in this person's favor. Like, so something you could do with a spreadsheet actually does a better job than this person who has a PhD and years of experience. And so in this sense, that psychologist is kind of failing at that first skill because they don't have good feedback on like, are my judgments well calibrated? Like, am I making good judgments about this person's, rate of recidivism or this kind of thing. But on the other hand, my guess is that they do a pretty good job at the second skill, which is like seeming like they know what they're talking about with their peers, like publishing good papers and being a good professional standing. And certainly if your goal was to be like an eminent physicist or an eminent philosopher, it's actually that skill that's more important for your career success. Now, I don't want to be totally cynical about it, like you shouldn't care about reality. Clearly that's a part of it, but it's just important to note that like they're not entirely overlapping skills. They're somewhat divergent skills. And so, similarly, like I'm in the writing lead profession. So if I can turn the lens on myself, there is a skill of having correct arguments, of like being true on matters of substance. But then there's just, you can obviously sell a lot of copies of books sometimes by saying something that's, exaggerated or false or this kind of thing. And so, obviously if you have some internal, integrity and then this kind of thing, you're going to try to reconcile that by, not totally abandoning your ideals. But it's pretty clear that these are two different skills. Like you can be an excellent purveyor of like ideas that are popular, even though they're, not that well grounded, or you can be, really rigorous and think about things in that way. And so I think that's an important thing to think about when we're talking about these kinds of fields that, maybe don't have that clear signal from the environment, that you're becoming more and more dependent on this signal from the expert community as the whole, or the peer group, or whoever is judging your ideas in discussions and discourse.
Oh. And as far as I remember that you also learned drawing, right? You learned the sketches. Yeah. So for that kind of skill that relies more on creativity and intuition, I think. So maybe for us, like writing style is one of them. So how can your learning methods be applied to this field without becoming so rigid?
Well, so first of all, I'd say that I think it's a little bit of a misnomer that it, like representational art, for instance, is like extremely creative compared to, let's say, something like programming or writing or this kind of thing. And I'll use my project as an example. Like I think I was being mostly judged on like how accurate the drawing was. And in this sense, it's a very technical skill. Like it's something that you could learn. It requires careful attention to detail, precision, but it's not that different from other skills that require precision. I think when we're talking about creativity or intuition or these kind of things, which I do think are really important, I don't necessarily think that they follow exactly the same recipe. I think, for lack of a better word, a lot of what that is like the ability to generate good ideas and the ability to have taste, like the ability to like sense, this is a good idea, this is a bad idea. And my sort of like naive mental model of how that skill actually develops is that to have taste is essentially you've just sampled so many ideas and gotten some measure of their quality that you are able to see a good idea when it comes along. And so that's what I've seen in a lot of fields that not even necessarily fields that people traditionally regard as creative, but even like, let's say entrepreneurship, for instance, if you talk to someone who's had a lot of entrepreneurial ventures and then you sort of like suggest some idea, they can tell kind of whether it's a good idea or not, just like by feel, just like, that doesn't sound like a good idea. And I don't want to say that they're always right. That feeling can misfire, but my sense is where that intuition comes from is that you've just seen many, many examples of people trying things and succeeding and failing. And so you kind of develop these sort of unconscious patterns that you're applying to that, so that when you hear about that idea, it's like, well, it hits this, and this point that you don't even realize it's hitting. And you causes you to think, okay, maybe that's a good idea, but it misses these ones or that kind of thing. And so you're weighting it on that. And so my guess is that something similar is happening with creative fields. But again, it goes back to what we were talking about like what makes something creative. I even talk about this. I have a chapter on creativity. I gotta really talk about everything in this book. I have a chapter on creativity, and I sort of talk about the social psychologist Mihai Csikszentmihalyi. Say that 10 times fast. But Mihai Csikszentmihalyi has this whole theory that like creativity isn't something that is an objective fact about an idea. It is something that is always defined on this background of this social context, that what gets deemed a creative work of art, a movie, a book, any kind of thing like that, an invention, is always, there's some community of experts that is deciding whether or not that's good. And so I think in many cases, what it means to have taste is to have like a really well-calibrated sense of this community, this group of people that have some opinion to be like well calibrated to like, this is the kind of thing that the artistic community or the scientific community or the patent officers or whatever is going to think is novel, is going to think this is some important innovation. And so, going back to what we were talking about, this see-do feedback, that I think also applies to taste. This is something that like, I write in the book, this sort of association with these sort of communities of experts is so important because a lot of what you're learning sort of implicitly is how do they judge ideas? How do they think about it? And as you spend more time with someone, seeing them judging ideas, seeing them form evaluations, you don't get a perfect replication of their mind in your mind, but you start to like have this little black box. You're like, what would so-and-so think about this? And I think that's super important. I've heard from a lot of people in, elite research fields and this kind of stuff that like your advisor that you have is so important, not just because they're going to like give you prestige and funding and this kind of stuff, but they're going to give in their sense of taste of like, these are the kinds of problems and projects that if you work on them, you're going to have a great career in this field. And if you're not in that institution, you're working with someone who has like a middling publishing record, or it's not an elite field, they're not going to have the same taste, and they're not going to necessarily push you to like, no, but you should be working on this. This is an important problem. Don't work on that other thing. And so, again, to take this sort of bird's eye view, I think like, even though we're talking about technical skills where the components of the skill are often quite explicit and like you can write them down and treat them this, I think even intuitive soft skills, it operates on a very similar level.
So I think in this era of AI, there's a keyword you just say that taste is a taste.
Yeah.
So I think, is it possibly is the value of human in the future is our taste? Because AI, they know everything. AI can tell everything. So what is the value of human learning?
Oh man, making predictions, to use a Yogi Berra quote, making predictions is hard, especially about the future. But but the idea about what AI is going to be good and bad at in the future, I think it is hard to say because, I would say if you asked me, like, look at like the progress like 10 years ago and you say like, where do you think the future is going to be? I would have said, well, like, it's going to be really good at like math and these kind of hard fields, but it's not going to be able to do any writing because like that's creative, right? But it turns out that like actually it turns out a lot of writing is really amenable to this. Now I would say, as I'm a little bit of professional conceit here, but I occasionally will like, I don't use it, I don't publish it, but occasionally I'll ask like AI to like generate some text for me about something. And that often helps like, spur your thinking and stuff. I'm never publishing this, but the thing that I'm often struck by is that like it's unusable as it is. Like I'm like, this is bad. Like it's knowledgeable, but it's like it's bad in all these ways that you try to avoid as a writer. Like it's too cliched, it's a little too much following the formula, it's a little bit too like, it just doesn't hit right. And so I think again, it's this idea of taste. Will future models have taste? I don't know whether that, but like certainly it's the case that, if you just take like a naive extrapolation of where we are right now, that kind of taste that you imbibe from seeing a lot of like judgment of good and bad examples of this and that, I do think it seems to be important. And I think I wouldn't say that that's the only thing, because I think, it's the difference between being a great art critic and a great artist. And I think, certainly you need more than just taste. You need to have some kind of ability to put the discernment into good functional use in a lot of cases. But often that is a hard thing to acquire. Like, what makes something good writing? What makes something good art, good code, good, good business ideas, just because the criteria is often so vague.
Because I wanted to argue one thing, that maybe in Asian culture, we pursue the score. We wanted to answer everything right. So like if you ask us a question, we will answer the correct answer. Like which country is blah, blah, blah. We can answer that. But sometimes I think it's much more important to focus on the context, because in Chinese, maybe we don't talk about context that much in English, because when I talk to like English speaker like you or other authors, they always mention something that, could you please explain what's the context? Could you tell me about the context? But in Chinese, we just answer the question. We just answer the correct the question. Yeah, so I find it's very, very, very different in these two kind of thinking. So maybe in the AI era, the context or the taste, because when you know everything, you know the whole picture, you kind of have the taste, you kind of know the context. So I think maybe it's the reason why we still have to learn as a human being. Yeah, so yeah, this is my point of view. I don't know if you agree or not, or what's your take?
You know, it's funny you say that because I really try to avoid essentializing too much about like, well, this is Western culture, this is Chinese culture. Not because there aren't differences. Like I am, you know, I'm like 100% Westerner. You can definitely feel that when you're in East Asia. But I think your point about how I think the sort of what you view as the kind of like prototypical maybe Chinese or East Asian response of like, this is the correct answer, like this is what you want to have on the report. Funnily enough, I would say that there's been a lot of thinkers who argue that like East Asian thinking is the opposite of that. So there is this book, it's called The Geography of Thought in English. Maybe you can find the author's name. It's just escaping me right now. But Richard Nisbett, I think, was one of them. I don't remember the other author. And he makes this argument. I'm not sure, I'm not necessarily endorsing this book, by the way. I'm just pointing it out as like a counterpoint that Western thought, like if you go kind of like philosophical tradition back to Aristotle and stuff, Western thought tends to be more decontextualizing, more atomizing, more like about logic and these principles, whereas East Asian thought, particularly Chinese thought and this kind of thing, tends to be more contextual, holistic, relational. And people have thrown out all sorts of examples, like for instance, that like as a language, Chinese tends to be more contextually dependent. So you can often drop parts of the language in ways that it'll just be obvious in that situation, but it actually creates an ambiguity, whereas that would need to be spelled out in English or maybe another Western language. So I don't want to deny your point, and maybe your point is true. I tend to think it's maybe more a function of the educational system. So I think that in East Asian countries, I would include India in this as well. There's a highly competitive examination type process.
Yeah.
And because of the intense competition, that is pushing the scholastic system to more objective standards, to trying to be more objective, because it's unfair to judge people on vague criteria if it's like the stakes are so high. And so because of that, I think the educational system, like you were saying, like there is a correct answer, this is the definition for this kind of thing. And so I think it's maybe a byproduct of that educational system rather than maybe like a deep-seated function of like how maybe Chinese people think versus how Westerners think. My own feeling is that I think that there's always elements of this in the background of the culture if you look for it. I wrote an essay, this was a long time ago after my experience on the mainland, and it was just sort of about how this C element of this sort of three-part structure I have is much more respected in East Asia than it is in the West. So I would say that there is a much more a culture of respecting someone who's viewed as authority, viewed as an expert. This is the right way to do things, often imitating more directly. But whereas in the West, there's often this sense that like, well, you shouldn't do that too much. You should like come up with your own answer and like, you know, and I think both sides have some points, but I think that at least because I'm coming from a Western context, that there's a lot of things the sort of Western educational system could learn from the sort of Chinese example and this kind of stuff. And I think certainly in East Asia, the like academic performance on average in many of these schools is incredibly high. And I think some of that is because of the value that's stressed on education there. But I think some of it is also that in the West, we've kind of like the idea of direct instruction and like, you know, okay, this is the right way to do this. And like, you know, I've like studied this and learned that this is the right idea. Just, I'm going to just teach it to you, has kind of fallen out of disfavor. There was a period of time, I would say, there's always been oscillating educational trends, but I think there was a period of time really cresting in like the 1970s and 80s where, you know, well, that was sort of like a faux pas. Like what you should be doing is like, it should all be like problem solving and discovery learning and this kind of thing. And I think we're only really realizing now that for most kids, most of the time, that actually doesn't work as well as the more, what we could call like the model that's more prominent in East Asia. So I do think, you know, cross-cultural communication is very valid because sometimes you don't realize, you know, you're in some sort of milieu, you don't realize, okay, there's another way of doing it. And I think, you know, certainly both academically and also economically, the East Asian countries have performed like so exceptionally well, in part because of this ability to like, this is what's working in some other place and we're going to like figure it out and do it fastidiously. Whereas a lot of other countries are struggling to do that, you know?
Yeah, I really like your perspective. There are always some pros and cons or some combination of different thinking. Yeah, and I want to raise another question because there are many book lovers following my channel. So they always share a common concern. They always message me like that. They read a lot, but forget quickly. So like, how would you suggest that how we select content worth remembering and make this kind of knowledge stick longer?
So I think in some ways you remember what you're paying attention to. And so I think a lot of times when you're struggling to remember things, it's because you weren't really paying attention to it and integrating it in a useful way when you were covering it. And so I always recommend when people are reading books, like, if you're just reading a book just to flip through the pages, it's going to be harder, I think, to retain it than if there is some practical application or some useful question or something that like you're actively thinking about when you're reading it. Because ultimately what you absorb from your reading is, there's some really interesting cognitive science research that I won't bore all the readers with here, but it's this fusion, this union of all the things you already know and the things that you're learning. So in some ways the problem is already solved. If you're reading a lot of books, reading itself is one of the best ways to acquire more knowledge, because as you know more about a topic, it's easier to slot in new knowledge that you acquire. But I think that the added step of that is that if you can read with a particular eye to like, this is how I'm going to use this is what's interesting about this is, you have questions in mind, this sort of curious seeking, then you're actively bringing up your own knowledge. You're like, wait a minute, that doesn't make sense. Or, that's contradicted by what you said earlier, or this kind of thing. If you're kind of making these sort of anticipatory thoughts while you're reading, you're naturally paying attention more, and it's more likely that you're going to absorb it and read it. And so I think, I think that for specific cases where you're trying to memorize something, where you're trying to like internalize something, then there's lots of methodologies you can use. We can talk about spaced repetition software, mnemonics, some of these other techniques. But I think at a fundamental level, the more that you know about a topic and the more interested you are in the topic, those are like probably the most important factors for how well you can assemble information. Not sure if it's entirely relevant here, but this is like, if I were writing a chapter of a book about this story, about this topic that you just raised, I would probably start with the idea of savants. So savants are people who otherwise have some kind of intellectual disability. So they, Kim Peek is one of the famous examples that he was, quite severely autistic and probably had an IQ of like around 70 if you were to measure it, his standard tests. Wow. But he was also like a brilliant genius in many other ways. Like he could read through a phone book once and remember every single number. So you could tell him what was like Joan Allen's phone number and he could spit it out. So like things that would just seem to be impossible for a normal person. And I think it's very interesting that one of the explanations for savant syndrome, one of the ideas is that their sort of phenomenal abilities, because this defect in their brain actually causes them to be much more interested in things that a normal person would not find interesting. So essentially this sort of like function of like, he really pays attention to the numbers and like he really cares what they are, and it like really motivates him. That's what allows him to remember them. Just the same way that, if you're watching an engrossing movie and you're following you could probably remember quite a bit of the plot, even though like just the raw amount of bits of information for the plot is actually quite a bit. So I think this idea of interest and motivation and attention, they're all tuned towards memory in this important way. And, maybe that's a reason to read interesting books and to be interested in reading books too, right?
Yeah, so it's not about skill. It's sometimes, it's more like how do you think about what is your mindset? What is your context about this thing? Yeah, so let's talk about one of your upcoming major projects is your online course. Yeah, because your online course, you collaborate with Taiwan's Press Play Academy, which is my favorite platform. So you got to push out a online course called the Ultimate Learning System and 6-week action plan, the learning methods for rapid mastery. So is this online course like comparing to your two books? What's the biggest difference? What content or method are included in the online course but not covered in the books?
Yeah, so this course I've actually been teaching for a number of years. We have an English version of the course. And so I would say the main difference is that when I write books, the focus is on trying to kind of convey ideas and to persuade you in stories and this kind of thing. Whereas when I'm teaching a course, my mindset is totally different. My mindset is kind of like, okay, you have something you want to learn and I'm going to like guide you through it step by step. And so the course in, you know, if you've read the books at the philosophical level, the course is in harmony with them. So it's not like I'm teaching a completely different method in the course compared to the books. One of the things that I've learned having taught courses now for like, you know, a better part of 2 decades online is that the specifics, the details really matter, right? So we've been talking, you know, quite generically about like see, do, feedback. But like, what does that mean for you actually like learning a programming language today? Or what does that actually mean for like learning, you know, English or one of these things? And so the 6-week course, I spend a lot of time kind of working on this sort of step-by-step framework of like, okay, this is what we're going to do and work through. And a lot of that is even practical stuff. So, you know, I think the first 2 weeks of the course, the first week is on designing a project, and the second week is on designing a productivity system. And the idea there is to like go from, I have this general idea of I'd like to be better at X, Y, or Z, down to I have a very specific project that has a specific timeline. I've broken it down week by week of what I need to do. And then I've broken that down even further to be like what I should be doing right now. And you know, it's impressive, but that's so essential for motivation for doing these things. So I would say, yeah, the main difference between these things is that the scope of the course is much more on the nuts and bolts, is much more on the details. Like I have, you know, extended walkthroughs about how to use particular learning techniques, which, you know, I can devote like a few sentences to in the book, but, you know, I think the books are kind of like there to get you inspired. They're get you to like, okay, you know, I got some ideas, I got some running. And, you know, that's enough for a lot of people. I don't want to say that I'm deliberately withholding things, but I think in the course, I'm not sure exactly because I have the English version of the course, but I think I had like a 2-hour video of us like discovering how to like take notes properly and stuff. And I have like a very detailed discussion of various mnemonic techniques and like, this is the proper way to do flashcards. And this is the proper way to, you know, think about practice and stuff. And so I think if you were someone who maybe you'd heard of my books, or maybe you're hearing them for the first time now, and you are sold on this idea of like, I want to be a more effective learner, then I think the course is kind of like, it is the ultimate sort of in actually walking you through it. And I think you can just do this for yourself. Like just think about times where you've like, you know, read a book about something versus like you've had an instructor, you've been in a classroom, you've like, there's been worksheets and homework assignments and this kind of stuff. You definitely get a more robust experience in the latter.
So when you are designing the course, it sounds like you're more focused on the practical methods or practical like maybe templates or some kind of that, so we can apply to our like daily use or our work. So let's have an example. Like if I was going to learn like AI vibe coding, vibe programming. So if I want to learn this thing and I wanted to attend your class and to turn your online course into my action. So what exactly does it look like when I just use your material or use your templates kind of thing?
Yeah, so I would say that the course has been designed so that you pair it with something that you want to learn. So that's also already kind of, you know, it's obvious to me, but it's like something that maybe deserves explanation. But the way you learn to get better at learning is by learning things, right? And so if you just take this course and it's just information, then it's like, again, the see, do, feedback, you're only doing the see part. You're not doing the do and the feedback part. And those are really important for getting better at learning as well as any other skill. And so the idea here is that I'm going to like in the first week, I'll go through all the 6 weeks. In the first week, I'm going to teach you about how to design a successful project. And so I talk about like not only how I design projects like the MIT challenge and the Year Without English, but also like this is how you design a project if you're in a formal classroom. This is how you design a project where you're mostly learning knowledge. This is how you design a project where you're trying to learn a professional skill. So I go through all these examples. And the end product of that week is that you should have like some kind of curriculum that you're following. And it's broken down to a week by week level. So you know what you need to do week 1, week 2, week 3. In broad terms, not that it's a super rigid plan that you have to follow, but it gives you so much clarity of like, I know what I need to do to get started. The second week is productivity. So that one is talking a lot about motivation, procrastination. How do you focus? How do you stick to it? And a big part of that is breaking down that weekly idea. Like this is the weekly chunk I have to do, which already does a lot, down to this level of like, okay, this is what I'm working on today. This is what I'm working on right now. This is where I'm fitting it in my schedule. This is like, you know, putting that studying slot at a point in time where I'm going to have more energy and making sure that I'm, not burning myself out by trying to study too much and balancing my other obligations. Very important. So we haven't even gotten into learning yet. This is just sort of like getting the foundation so that you can actually learn properly in place. The third week is about practice. So we were talking about that in the kind of do section of the book. But basically, I have a lot of the research on how you design your practice, like how much practice should be part of your studying schedule. So like, how do you compare, reading the book and doing the lectures and doing practice problems and doing other techniques that like, you've heard about for learning, like how much practice should be, what kind of practice should you be doing? How do you tailor it to your level? How do you tailor it to your goals? So there's a lot of stuff on there, and there's so much variety about there. Like if you want to learn a language, you could do flashcards, you could listen to television shows, you could do conversation practice, you could do all these sorts of things. And it can be bewildering to make those choices about like, how do you make those decisions? So I talk about practice there and like how to think about it. Then we talk about insight, which is about understanding and developing mental models and how do you think more deeply about this. So I talk about things like the Feynman technique I talked about in ultra learning as well, but we go into a lot more detail about like different ways you can apply this to different things. So like the way that you would develop insight or intuition about, a physics problem is going to be maybe different from like a business concept or some sort of thing that you want some kind of more general understanding of. And so that would be the next phase. And then we talk about memory. So how do you ensure that you remember things? I talk about a lot about mnemonics, a lot about different ways that you can memorize things, very important for things like language learning. And then finally, mastery is about not this particular project, but like how can you turn this into a repeatable system so that you can just apply this to everything you want to learn, and how do you like maintain skills in the long run and deal with, I learned this intensively, but now I'm forgetting it, like you mentioned with the books. So to use your sort of vibe coding example, if someone were going through this project, the first step would be creating that curriculum. So like, this is what I'm actually going to follow to get good at the vibe coding. And then you're going to be breaking that down. So like, this is what I'm working on today. This is what I'm working on right now. This is how I'm managing my time. Your practice. So you're, presumably following some kind of tutorials. You're learning from maybe AI itself is giving you some of these examples, but you're doing practice as well. So maybe you have your own little programming project that you're doing. You're trying to choose the right scope. You're trying to choose like, should I do a big thing? Do I do a small thing? Do I do like multiple different things? How do I do this kind of practice? And then you're getting the intuition. What are the mental models I need to be able to guide this process to actually like make good decisions about which programming languages should I use? What are the like ways that I should think about how the AI does this? What is it good at? What is it not good at? Like these are mental models that you have to apply, these intuitions you have to apply. And then memory, I don't think for vibe coding, the memory would be super important, but I've certainly talked to a lot of people that if you're doing more traditional programming, which is, I think, a very good complementary skill to vibe coding. I don't think we're at this point where you should never try to learn to program anymore. But if you are trying to learn programming, then like understanding syntax, memorizing syntax, having a good memory for like, oh, this is how you do X, Y, or Z in this language is very important. And so that would clearly apply. And then finally, this mastery idea would be stepping back from this particular project that maybe you worked on for 6 weeks or 2 months or 3 months, getting good at this particular skill. How does this fit into your whole life? How do you become a lifelong learner? How do you stack projects together so that you can actually turn, building little bits of skill into a great career, into a great business, into new hobbies, sports, this kind of thing. And so that's the approach. I've been teaching this course for years, and I feel like it's gotten increasingly refined. I've had multiple iterations of this. I've seen student successes, student failures. And, I think that's been the real virtue of doing this, is that, even though this is the first time we're publishing it in Taiwan, like I really do have like about 10 years of experience teaching this. So I have a lot of examples of, this is the like little things that students get wrong and like how to correct it and stuff.
Yeah, as you mentioned, you've delivered this course to like English users for many years, for like more than a decade. So is there any learning concept that you believed in first, but was completely changed afterward by your student feedback?
It's hard for me to say that there's a lot of ideas that I like totally, denounce now that I was fond of before, and certainly none that are in Rapid Learner. But I can think of like ideas that I was when I was like much younger. So I had a period of time, I'm talking about 20 years ago, where I thought speed reading was like a good strategy. And then I read a lot more of the research on speed reading, and I convinced myself, it's probably mostly skimming. And this idea, this holy grail that you can just read really fast and actually comprehend things is contradicted by a lot of what we know about, let's say, the physics of eye movements and some of the like really careful work that people who study the neurology of reading show that like it's kind of impossible for you to read at like 20,000 words per minute or maybe even 2,000 words per minute.
Yes.
That isn't to say that, you can't read faster at all, but that it tends to be more this kind of like what we were talking about, this sort of ordinary skill type issue. But I would say that for me, teaching the courses has not been so much about like, renouncing a particular idea that I had in the past, but more about understanding how you teach an idea and how it gets applied. And then like you're kind of twisting some dials to be like, people tend to overdo this or they get this wrong or this is a misconception. So to use an example, I feel like one of the things that I kind of started on, and it is very popular, is things like mnemonics or like strategies for memorizing things. But I found that people tend to overuse them a little bit. Like there are situations where investing in mnemonics is absolutely the right thing to do. I would say learning languages is one of those examples where essentially you have the same kind of content and you have to learn like 10,000 of them. So spending some time investing in a system so that you can like quickly learn new words can be very valuable, especially for like a pretty easy technique like the keyword mnemonic. But I also tend to be a little bit more pessimistic about like more elaborate systems. So I know some people, this is not my opinion, but I know people that, they teach courses about effective learning that it's entirely mnemonics. Like it's entirely like, here's how you use the memory palace and here's how you do, elaborate memory systems for memorizing things. And the thing that I don't like about it is that even though it is impressive that like you can do things that seem almost inhumanly impossible, sort of like Kim Peek type stuff where you're like flipping through the phone book and you can remember everyone's phone number, it tends to be less practical because we live in a world where people tend not to have that kind of memory. And so what we mostly need is like understanding and skill, and perfect verbatim memory of like arbitrary information is, it was more of a skill in the pre-literate world. So it was actually like, it was a more useful learning technique in like Socrates' time where they didn't have writing and everything was transmitted orally. Then like really memorizing what was said in the lecture is important because no one's writing it down. But, now we live in a world where like, we have writing and text. And so it tends to be less valuable. So I would say that I go back and forth on things, but it's not usually like, okay, that idea totally doesn't work, but it's more, I've given these ideas to people and they're overdoing this. This is a mistake they're making. And so that I think is the sort of benefit of doing a course for 10 years is not even that like this idea doesn't work, but like always situating it in that right context. This is a whole idea we were talking about context, right? It's that it's never that like this is the right technique or the wrong technique, but if you're using the right technique at the wrong time or in the wrong situation, or you are, not thinking about it in the right way, then, that's just the same as using a wrong technique. Like it can still be not helpful for your studying. So I do try my best to kind of like, hopefully weave students around some of those pitfalls.
Yeah. I think Taiwan students, we are so lucky because your course has been fine-tuned and optimized, iterate over past like decades. So we get the very best version of your course in Chinese. So wow, I'm very excited about it. And lastly, I wanted to ask you is there any new learning project for you that maybe you want to accomplish but haven't started yet or just in progress?
I mean, there always are. Well, I was just talking about one that I just recently finished this last year. So this was called, I was calling it Foundations, and I was the 12-month one that I was doing. So anyone who wants to go to my website, my blog, it is in English. So, if you're not comfortable in English, if you're reading this with the subtitles right now, you'll have to click the translate button. But I've been, doing that project. So that one just wrapped up. So I'm in a little bit of a lull between projects. But I think, one area that I've really wanted to explore more deeply is just sort of a lot of, like you were alluding to, a lot of these new AI technologies. I already use them quite a bit in like helping me find research sources, helping me kind of curate things. But I think part of the excitement of having like a brand new field is that like, it's still a bit of a frontier. Like even what is possible with it is very new. And I've been very interested in, applying this to learning itself, because clearly the ability to, deal with a lot of the problems of learning, like, memory and understanding and this kind of stuff, there's now kind of new techniques available. So this is one thing that I'm hoping to explore a little bit in the future.
Thank you for sharing, Scott. And finally, could you give us some encouragement or blessing in Chinese to our audience?
谢谢大家，我希望所有的人听我说，你可以努力学习，快乐学习，加油，大家，谢谢。
Wow, thank you, Scott. This is such an encouragement for us. I like the happy learning thing. The happy is the most important
快乐
thing.
学习
Yeah.
I think 努力学习，如果就是努力学习是没有那个感觉，需要快乐学习。
Yeah, we need more happiness.
Yes, of course.
Okay. Thank you, Scott, for accepting my interview. So we learned so much from you. And
Thank you so much.
It's truly been an honor to have you here. So I'll compile those information about your books and your online course into the show notes. And those audience who are interested are welcome to check it out. And a big thank you to all audience who are listening right now. If you have any thought or suggestion for me, please leave the comment to me. So yeah, we are approaching the end of the show. So if you enjoyed today's content, please subscribe to What to Read Next. You can also subscribe to my newsletter and receive the latest book reviews and inspiring book quotes every week. So see you next time. Bye bye.